Have you ever looked at another Christian and quietly wondered what it was that you were missing? Maybe you were at church, maybe it was a Bible study, maybe you were just sitting around eating lunch and just talking, but it seemed like their faith was vibrant and alive and real. They talked about Christ like he was actually real to them, a close friend in a chair right beside them. And you listen to that talk or you watch them and you feel stuck, not hostile to God, not walking away from your faith, just maybe tired and flat and distant. If you've ever felt that way, it's isolating because you're in the exact same room, same songs, same words on the screen, and somehow you feel like you're living in a completely different reality than the person and the people around you. You almost feel like everyone else in that room got handed some kind of a secret transmission and you never picked up the signal. If that's you, if that's been you for a week or a year or as long as you can remember, then this episode is for you. Because the man we're reading today has met thousands of people exactly where you are. And the first thing that he wants to tell you is that you have misdiagnosed yourself. This is Autopsy, a podcast about the hidden theology beneath ordinary Christian experience. Every episode, we examine the ideas, assumptions, desires, and doctrines that shape how we actually live, how we suffer, how we worship, how we struggle, and how we believe. Using scripture and the wisdom of Christians past and present, we ask a very simple question. What if theology explains more of your life than you think? I'm Chris Ruwalt, and this is Autopsy. So let's lay today's subject on the table, something every Christian feels at some point along the way, but very few can really name. Our guide today is a man by the name of Martyn Lloyd-Jones. And Martyn Lloyd-Jones was a 20th century doctor who became a minister. And he wrote a book called Spiritual Depression. And he writes to the person we just described, the person who's just feeling sort of flat. It's very helpful that we define our terms first because he uses the word numbness, but not in the way that our culture thinks of it. When we say numb, we usually think of, or we mean no emotion or no passion. Our battery is at 4% and we need to be charged up. And Martyn Lloyd-Jones says that that kind of language and that kind of definition really misses the point. He argues that spiritual numbness is not the absence of faith. It's the inability to understand what is happening inside of you. He writes about Christians who have lost their ability to read their own spiritual experiences correctly. It's like misreading the dashboard of your car. The warning light comes on, and it's easy to assume that the entire car is sort of on lockdown or the whole thing is about to fall apart. But the light isn't the engine dying. The light is just information. The light is just the car telling you, hey, you need to take a look at this. In the moment, though, it never feels like information. It feels like a verdict. You feel one flicker of distance from God, and the voice inside doesn't say, hey, we need to check this, or we need to look closer at this. The voice inside of you says, well, that's it. It's over. And so here's the big idea for today's episode. Many Christians mistake a normal spiritual struggle for a total spiritual failure. Before we can fix the misreading, we have to admit something uncomfortable. Our acceptance of the condition is a big part of the problem. We've quietly decided that this feeling of flatness or numbness, maybe being a little cynical, is just sort of the normal adult baseline. And Martyn Lloyd-Jones refuses to accept that. He makes a rather startling claim in his book. He says the church has become far too accustomed to unhappy Christians. He treats discouragement not like something that's normal, but as something that is abnormal. He even says that a depressed Christian is a contradiction in terms. Think about that statement. Are we okay with that? After all, isn't life just objectively hard? We experience grief, we experience economic stress, we have aging parents, we have bills, we have families who don't always get along the way that we wish they would. Why shouldn't a Christian be discouraged just like everyone else? Calling it a contradiction can almost feel naive about real suffering. And that tension is exactly why Martyn Lloyd-Jones is so careful with his terms. He's not asking you to walk around with a fake grin plastered on your face while everything is falling apart. He's not telling you to ignore a brutal world or to pretend that suffering isn't real or that oppression isn't real. But he says a fundamental joy, a deep, unshakable anchor underneath the circumstances, is supposed to be a Christian's normal experience. To say it a slightly different way, it's the air that we're supposed to breathe. So when a Christian is always drained, and when there's never joy anywhere underneath, that deserves investigation. It means something in the foundation has gone wrong. And Martyn Lloyd-Jones is very pragmatic about it. He's very practical. He says the world looks at faith and asks one question: does it work? So picture the sales pitch. If the pitch for your faith is, come find ultimate peace and joy, but all the salespeople look miserable, then nobody's going to buy what you're selling. It's not meant to make you feel guilty. He's saying the misery is itself a symptom. Back to the dashboard idea. The light comes on and it's pointing at a problem. Most of us have been told for years to just manage the flatness, manage the joylessness. And Martyn Lloyd-Jones says, no, you have to look under the hood. So how do you know when you've crossed the line from maybe a normal sadness or the normal experience of going through something hard, and you've crossed into what he calls a spiritual fog? Martyn Lloyd-Jones anchors the whole description in the 42nd Psalm. And if you read that psalm, the psalmist calls himself cast down, troubled, disquieted. The physical toll is intense. He writes that his tears have become his food day and night. He's constantly weeping. He doesn't have an appetite. He looks haggard. And Lloyd-Jones paints him as a man carrying the whole universe on his back. Now translate those ancient symptoms into a Tuesday in your life, because the psychology maps perfectly. The tears day and night, the modern version of that might be just scrolling incessantly, scrolling through life in a state of spiritual exhaustion. You wake up tired. There's a constant low-level hum of discouragement. There's an inability to enjoy God. You're not out committing scandalous sin. That's not what we're talking about. You're just drained and endlessly analyzing your own sense of emptiness. And it's sneaky because none of it looks like a crisis from the outside. There's no dramatic fall. It's more of a slow leak, a little less appetite for the things that you used to enjoy, a little more time on your phone, a little flatter every month. And that self-analysis is exactly where the real danger starts. And here's why that is true. Because the second we recognize the symptoms, the second we recognize the fatigue, the distance, the scrolling, our instinct is to perform an autopsy on our own faith. We want to know, why did this die? And we botch the analysis every time. We immediately rule it a theological crisis. God is withdrawn. I've done something unforgivable. In other words, we blame ourselves spiritually first. But here's where the physician shows up, because Lloyd-Jones was a trained medical doctor, and he refuses these simplistic answers. And what I like about Lloyd-Jones is that he examines the whole human being. We always automatically assume it's a sin problem, and it might be a sin problem, but it's not necessarily a sin problem, as he points out. He says it might be a biology problem, or it might be a personality problem. So take, for example, what we call temperament. It's another word for personality. Some people are just introverted. Their focus naturally turns and stays inward. Now, that can produce real depth. Some of the greatest Christians in history were this kind of personality. But the flip side of that is that it can also slip into sort of this morbid, introspective echo chamber. When an introvert feels dry, they don't look outward for help, they look inward, and they can analyze their own flaws to the point to where they kind of paralyze themselves. And they just get in this endless loop of self-critique. And the cruel part is that the loop feels like spiritual seriousness. It feels like you're doing the hard work. But the very thing you think is helping is the thing that's keeping you stuck. So he says it might be a personality issue. But he also says it might be a physical issue, which we overlook. You cannot isolate your body, mind, and spirit as though they exist apart from one another. They share the same nervous system. Fatigue actually changes your ability to process faith. And Lloyd-Jones points to a British preacher named Charles Spurgeon, one of the most famous preachers of all time, certainly of his era. And he battled debilitating gout. And Lloyd-Jones observes that when your body's whole attention goes to pain and survival, your brain loses the ability to sustain things like joy or passion. And so the non-essential functions are shut down. And Lloyd-Jones argues that physical agony was a primary driver of Spurgeon's depression. It wasn't a lack of faith. It was a body dragging a mind into the dark. And so here's a brutally practical application. Sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is take a nap, or eat, or see a doctor, or take a walk. The warning light might just mean that you're running on no rest. And so Lloyd-Jones is just going through these possible issues, personality, something physical. Then he lists a third possibility for this spiritual fog that we go through sometimes, this spiritual numbness. And he talks about how we react after a blessing. You hit a huge high. Maybe you are going through a time where you've been very successful at work, or you've been on a moving retreat, or you hit a milestone. And the letdown afterward can feel like spiritual abandonment. It's sort of an adrenaline rush. And Lloyd-Jones points to a man in the Old Testament named Elijah, who has an incredible victory at a place called Mount Carmel, and he's outrunning chariots. I mean, it's just the ultimate high. And the very next scene in his life, he's under a tree asking God to let him die. All the dopamine has drained. His brain says, I'm empty. And he reads that biological crash as God has left me. And underneath all of that, Martyn Lloyd-Jones names the spiritual attack. And he says the enemy takes the crash, the fatigue, the introverted self-analysis, and the enemy can twist that into unbelief. He waits until you're tired to whisper into your ear that you're a failure. So bring it back to the car. It's like you open the hood and you see the smoke and you assume that the entire engine block is just destroyed, when what you really need is just an oil change, or you are out of gas. But because you misdiagnosed it, you apply the wrong fix and you stay broken down on the side of the road. Misread the cause and you'll prescribe the wrong cure. And that leads us straight into the single most dangerous misdiagnosis of all. If you misread a dopamine crash or just a moment of fatigue as a lack of faith, what is your instinct? Your instinct is just like mine. Your instinct is to try harder, to work longer. And so you double down. The Christian thinks if I just prayed 2 hours instead of 1, if I just read 10 more books, if I volunteered more, if I read 5 more chapters of the Bible every day, if I forced myself to be holier, then I would finally feel more alive. And that is a fundamental misunderstanding of the gospel. Specifically, it's a misunderstanding of the doctrine of justification by faith. Because the moment you say, I have to do more spiritually, you've begun to build your entire joy on your own performance. And now you create a performance loop and a peace loop. If your peace depends on your performance, then you can never rest. Because your performance will always be flawed. It will never be perfect. Not on this side of heaven. And so for me, here's the application that gets me almost every time. You set yourself a threshold. You say to yourself, I'll only feel close to God if I'm perfectly patient with my kids today. And then by 7:30 in the morning, you snap at them. And already you failed to meet your goal. And now you can't enjoy any peace because the whole framework was built on a standard that you failed before you even got to the office. The operating system underneath is still my effort equals my standing. Lloyd-Jones turns to a case study for this problem. And his case study is a man named John Wesley. John Wesley was born in 1738. And John Wesley did everything humanly possible to manufacture joy by living right, or through his effort. He visited prisoners. He gave up his comfortable life. He crossed the dangerous Atlantic Ocean to preach the gospel in colonial Georgia. On paper, he did everything right, desperate to work his way into peace, and yet he was utterly and completely miserable. Just miserable. And it wasn't until he grasped the truth that he couldn't earn it, that he was justified by faith in Christ's finished work and not in his own deeds. And that's when the anxiety broke. And that's when the joy really showed up. And it's counterintuitive. We trap ourselves in this every single day with a sentence that reads, I just don't feel good enough for God. And we think by saying that and by thinking that, we think we're being humble. We think we're being reverent. But Lloyd-Jones diagnoses this, and he says that's actually a denial of our faith. Because what you're doing when you do that is that you are looking at your own performance instead of at Christ. You're essentially saying, my badness is stronger than his goodness. My sin is stronger than his grace. And that constant self-reliance leaves you stranded in this blurry sort of halfway state, which brings us to the most illuminating image in the entire book. Lloyd-Jones turns to a miracle in Mark chapter 8. And in Mark chapter 8, Jesus is healing a blind man. And he puts his hand on the man's eyes and he asks him a question. And the question is, can you see? And the man gives this unforgettable answer. The man says, listen to this. He says, I see men as trees walking. Think about that. The man isn't blind anymore. He can see. He sees something, but he's not yet seeing clearly. Everything is distorted. And Martyn Lloyd-Jones takes that physical sort of in-between state and makes it a portrait of the numb Christian. This is the person who knows the language of the church. This is the person who knows the doctrine, attends the services. They know enough truth to understand that the world is broken, but their own spiritual life is completely out of focus. They've seen enough to be dissatisfied, with the old life, but they haven't seen enough to be transformed by the new one. And so let's modernize this. Think about the person who gains perspective about the hustle culture. They realize the corner office won't make them happy. And they realize that endless consumerism is a trap. They see through all of that. But they refuse to be involved in any kind of real community. They refuse to commit themselves to a real belief system because commitment always requires vulnerability. And so they just sort of sit on the sidelines and they critique and they criticize and they become more and more cynical. They have enough vision to be miserable, but they refuse to take the step that will bring them joy. And Martyn Lloyd-Jones nails the reason they remain permanently on the edge. Close enough to admire Christ, close enough to agree with Christ on some things, close enough to quote him, but not close enough to surrender. And that is why they remain in this fog, because the fog feels safer. In the fog, you never have to be wrong. You never have to be confronted. You never have to be vulnerable. You never have to commit. You can always keep your exit plan. And they stay in that state where they see men as trees walking. It's the agony of knowing too much to be ignorant and too little to actually be at peace. So if that's the diagnosis, stuck in this state of blurriness, paralyzed by introspection and perfectionism, how do you clear your vision? What's the actual way to step out of the fog? And to find the first step, we have to go back to the text that gave us the symptoms. And so we turn back to Psalm 42. And this is where Lloyd-Jones points out something crucial that a lot of modern day Christians miss completely. When the psalmist is overwhelmed, he doesn't merely listen to himself, he preaches to himself. If you read this psalm, he comes to this place where he asks himself a question. And the question he asks himself is this: why are you cast down, O my soul? He treats his own soul like a separate person that he's going to question. Because the natural move, especially when you wake up day after day exhausted, is to let the thoughts just sort of take over. Your brain immediately begins to work through the list. Why am I tired? Why does God feel distant? Why am I such a failure? And we just sort of passively listen to this. Martyn Lloyd-Jones says the main art of learning to live spiritually is learning to preach to yourself. And so instead of listening to these thoughts in your brain passively, you begin to argue with those thoughts. Why are you so discouraged? Why are you so troubled when the gospel is true? Now, I'm not going to go deep on the mechanics of this in this episode, because that's where we're going to go next time. But for now, remember this: numbness and this state of spiritual blurriness is not defeated by more self-analysis. You don't get out of the fog by staring harder at it. You get out by reminding yourself what you know is true. And so how do we conclude today? We don't conclude where you might expect. We don't conclude with, you need more passion. We don't conclude with, you need more discipline. We close with the blind man, because the most important part of the miracle is what happens next. Because Jesus never intended to leave the man halfway healed. After the man says his vision is blurry, Jesus touches his eyes again. And the text says that the man saw everything clearly. Christ did not lead this man out of his blindness to give him a smudged, half-lit world and walk off, leaving him squinting at what he called walking trees for the rest of his life. That was never Jesus' plan. And God does not intend to leave his people in a blurry, numb state either. The Christian's heart and position is meant to be one of clarity and joy. And so hear this clearly, because it really changes everything. If your faith feels flat, if you've been seeing men as trees walking, your numbness may not be the absence of faith. It may just be that you're tired. It may just be a crash after a great victory. It may be an attack. It may be a foundation that was never properly laid. It may be partial sight that hasn't yet come into focus. What it is almost certainly not is the final word over you. And the way out is not more work. We don't have to fix our own engine. We have to trust the mechanic who designed it and stop misinterpreting the warning light on the dashboard. The honest move is the blind man's move. Tell the truth. Tell the truth about exactly how much you can see. No more and no less. Don't fake it. Don't call it hopeless. Keep looking to Christ until what is blurry becomes clear. because he never leaves anything unfinished. Now, before we wrap up, one last thought to carry back into your day. We've been talking about spiritual numbness, about this idea, but this idea of a halfway healing reaches far past your faith. If things seem blurry spiritually, how have you settled for less in other areas of your life? Maybe in your relationships, maybe in your work. Maybe you don't have as much joy in things that you once loved. It's easy to convince ourselves that this is just who we are now, that things like clarity and purpose and joy, those are for other people. It's easy to get used to the blur, but don't settle for the fog. Go and see clearly. And next time we're going to pick it up from there. And we're going to ask what it actually means to stop listening to yourself and start talking to yourself. It's the most practical idea in Martyn Lloyd-Jones' entire book, and you won't want to miss it. Thanks for listening to Autopsy. The goal of this podcast is not merely to teach theology, but to help us see our lives more truthfully in the light of God, Scripture, and the wisdom of the church. If the episode was helpful, subscribe, share it, and join us next time. And until then, do not settle for shallow explanations of the Christian life.